questions, then that would be, yeah, feel free to just interrupt me. Awesome. All right. Well, I'm going to get started, y'all. So I'm Sarah Rolliter. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I work at Bellarmine University in Louisville, Kentucky. If you're not familiar with us, we're a small Catholic institution right in the middle of the highlands of Louisville. And so we are a really kind of unique institution, and the Center for Community Engagement that I actually created these modules for was actually an office that we just started over the summer last year. So even though I'm actually now working in residence life, one of my favorite accomplishments so far at Bellarmine over the last 3 years of being here was helping to support the creation of that center. So we're really grateful to have that up and running, and the things that they're doing over there are really incredible. And it's crazy how much it has just grown and developed in less than a year already. So the Learn to Serve modules are just a piece of the puzzle. But I'm grateful we, have decided to create this resource, and I'm grateful to see how they'll expand even way beyond me. So let's talk about them. So Learn to Serve modules provide a brief reflective orientation for students embarking on sustained community engagement opportunities to provide them with common terms, challenge their sense of personal responsibility, and equip them with tools for respectfully entering communities they may not already be a part of. So what I mean by that is, given, like I said, we're a small Catholic institution, as you might imagine from that, a small Catholic institution in Kentucky, we do have a reasonably impressively diverse campus, but there's still a large population of white students, and a lot of assumptions about Bellarmine are untrue, given that about 30% of our students are Pell eligible and about 40% are first gen. So it is not necessarily what people would always expect, but it is still about 50% Catholic and predominantly white institution. And so sometimes the communities that we volunteer in or our students volunteer in aren't necessarily reflective of their backgrounds and aren't necessarily communities they've ever been in before, just as citizens in the city. So it's really important that the students are engaging in ways that are responsive to the community needs and are not harmful. And so we'll talk about what that looks like. So some examples of sustained community engagement where we would want to start off with these Learn to Serve modules and this orientation are, internships and practicums where students are going to be volunteering for like 30 plus hours in a semester with an organization. Alternative spring breaks. So a lot of your institutions probably have them. This is a picture from our Selma trip 2 years ago, rather. Gosh, it's been a long time. And of course, students are on those for, several days working with community partners. Mentor tutor programs, the programs where students are matched with, K-12 students. Courses with integrated community engagement, so what you might call like a service learning course. Volunteer commitments. So sometimes, some students they're not connected to any of these things, but they just work consistently with a particular organization, or we've connected them maybe due to some interests in a particular organization. And so, if they're consistently volunteering every week or so, that would certainly be a sustained community engagement opportunity. As well as our service-based student organizations. So some of them are also working with community partners consistently. And then also like advocacy groups or projects, which are kind of unique pieces, but we have groups on campus as well that are just seeking certain, advancing equity or different things in our community. And so we want to ensure that they have the tools to do that as well. So this is an open question. Feel free to unmute yourself and shout out kind of what your thoughts are on this, and please do. But do you all feel that students need an orientation into community engagement? And a couple questions here to sort of prompt that question would be, what are some concepts you all think students should know or be trained in before embarking on sustained community engagement experiences? And what concerns do you have with the ways that students may engage with community if they're not provided some sort of orientation?
I was going to say that it should be important to at least give them some training before they go, because it might be a community that they're not familiar with or not used to, so they might not necessarily know like the customs or some of the, I guess, some of the aspects that are unique to that community. So it might be good to, provide the training so that they have a little bit more of an understanding of how to interact with the people there.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure.
Yeah, I agree with Sekar. It's really good, important to have some kind of understanding of the community that you're going into. And if you can't have an understanding of the community, some sort of um, maybe like cultural competency or some sort of like understanding, even like an anti-racism training like this should be um, like taught or train or like a part of the training or orientation then.
What concerns do you all have with maybe ways that you've seen students engage even when they weren't necessarily oriented?
When folks go in and they behave as if they are sort of saviors instead of members of the community. So I think it's best to figure out how to become part of the community instead of acting like you're saving it.
Yes, that's a huge theme in these orientation modules for sure. And um, I feel that that's becoming a more prevalent conversation, but I also 100% agree that I don't think it's something. I mean, a lot of students come from high school where they all come from high school, but they come from places where they've done just like service projects or things in school, and those can be very savior oriented at times. Any other thoughts?
I would add the polarization that happens within the student group itself, with students who can identify with the community they're serving and students who can't. And so oftentimes those demographics can be quite isolating and at times really toxic.
I think that's a super, super strong point. And I know like when we were in Selma, I actually have some really close relationships with students that I went on that alternative spring break with my first year at Bellarmine still, and now that they're seniors. And that was actually a conversation we just had a couple days ago, was that a couple of them had a conflict due to the fact that we were talking about like food security at one point and like SNAP program and things like that. And one of them shared with me that like all of the, 2 years later, shared with me that she was really uncomfortable because she had been, part of those programs growing up, and some of the ways that her peers were talking about it or the questions they were asking just felt insensitive. And it made her feel like somewhat embarrassed, but mostly just uncomfortable. So I think that's a super valid point. I think like we've had just to be open, like I recall a service kind of project, so to speak, that we organized, and as students were taking like a bus to the west end of Louisville, like one of them was asking the faculty member, like, are we gonna get shot? And it was appalling, obviously. Like, first of all, no, the answer is no. Someone who lives in that neighborhood might be more likely in your neighborhood to be in danger than you would in theirs. However, like, I'm sure there were students in that bus who perhaps grew up in that area of Louisville. And so that would be so incredibly jarring and disrespectful. And so we've seen these things happen, and we have to prevent them, obviously, because it's really unfair to do that. Like you said, not just to the community members, but also to the peers that might be part of that group. So what are some methods of orientation that you all have utilized before we jump into the modules themselves that we are utilizing? What are some methods of orientation or tools or training or practices that you all have already utilized to prepare students for these sustained community engagement experiences?
Hi, Sarah. I have an example for you. My name is Ryan. I'm coming from UConn up in the Northeast. I think for most of my experiences, because it's not in my technical day job, but it's some of the other roles I do with the university, it's with especially with our alternative break programs, is doing long-term pre-trip meetings. So not just one session, but multiple that scaffold upon each other and build on students doing some self-reflection, some low-level community building within the groups that students feel comfortable sharing with more like tougher conversations. And then tying into actual, not just content about the students themselves, but obviously the community and the history of the community, and not just what's going on currently, but what may have influenced socioculturally leading up to kind of the context the students are going into.
Are there other examples anyone would like to share as well? Thank you, by the way. Well, let's jump into the modules. So I'm going to be doing a little bit of bouncing around some tabs here because the modules are, the way that they're designed is that they are three, they're videos basically, but they're like voiced over presentations. And we use this platform called Kaltura. So the platform allows us to voice over the presentation, and then it also allows us to create like stopping points in the videos where a question will pop up for the students to reflect on. And then they can choose to move forward in the video once they've kind of engaged with that reflection. So that's how they're set up. Obviously, it wouldn't be wise for us to try to stream multiple videos during this time. So I'm going to kind of transition to going through these tabs and showing you kind of the back end of the PowerPoints that were used to go through the content of the modules. So let me pull those up. I have to stop screen sharing this so I can screen share that, which is always fun. Okay. All right, I think I'm in. Oh shoot, it's doing that thing where it won't let me move the tab. Okay. So the very first one is stuck, actually. There we go. It's called Meaningful Partnerships, and it is some terms and tools for mutually beneficial community partnerships. And so basically this one lays the groundwork. It kind of opens up the question of what is community engagement, provides a definition, defines community partner, defines some different kinds of engagement. And then it starts to open up the question of why it is important to work with community organizations or community partners to do this work. And so the reason that I really wanted to start that conversation early on is that a lot of times students learn, about issues that exist, and they, like, while they're in college, and suddenly they're like, oh gosh, like I have to solve this issue, and they start trying to recreate the wheel, and not without understanding that organizations have been doing this, in communities for decades, and that the communities already are experts of these issues. And so this kind of opens up that piece. And then it kind of wraps up with a model for critical reflection so that they can implement some reflection as they're engaging. And this particular video also has a pausing point at the end of this piece, which asks them, like, how would they implement this or another model of reflection while they're engaging. The second one is called Service and Community Engagement. And it's very different. It's less informational and is a lot more of a reflective journaling kind of prompt, so that they can explore their own philosophies on these subjects. So it kind of opens up the question, like, why serve, or why volunteer, why engage? And here in Louisville, if you didn't know, Muhammad Ali was born in Louisville, Kentucky, and grew up here. So we love a good Muhammad Ali quote. But one thing I really like about this quote, and the reason I implemented it here, is because you can kind of ask, like, if service is the rent you pay for your room here on earth, then who is the landlord? Like, who do you owe service to? Do you owe service to anyone? And it kind of gives them the opportunity to think through that. Then we start to kind of examine the words or phrases service and community engagement, and ask them to think about the language of that, or the rhetoric. Is there a difference? What do they evoke? Is there, a reason to use one over the other, or one versus the other in different situations? And the reason that we want to do this is that it might seem unimportant, but it kind of opens up that conversation that you had mentioned about saviorism, specifically with like white saviorism due to kind of our student demographic. And it opens up this kind of conversation. So we kind of ask them to, like, it pauses here so that they can use their journal prompt and think through that themselves. But then we provide some insights from our perspective as a center about like how it needs to be mutually beneficial, and community engagement kind of takes the focus away from what a person can do for that community and redirects it to how they can work with the community. And then it actually opens up the kind of language about deficit-based versus asset-based lens, which we'll look at a lot more in the third module. Also reminds them that service is not like an inherently bad thing, and it can be valuable in certain kind of situations when an organization just needs like a task completed in a one-time kind of circumstance, but how it can also be something where they need to be careful not to lead to that savior or servant mindset, and rather think through being like a citizen and a participant. So we kind of just end on helping them to define these two terms, and kind of think through like identifying what their upcoming experience is, whether it's service or community engagement or some hybrid. And then the third module, so the first two are much shorter. They're like 5 and 7 minutes. This one is almost 20 minutes. And that's because it's a huge, huge subject. And it really dives into the cultural humility piece that's so important. So as you can see, we open up by saying some, because we want to make it super clear that this is not an exhaustive list or an exhaustive lesson on how to be culturally humble, but rather it's kind of a jumping point. So shout out to our Office of Identity and Inclusion at Bellarmine. They provided some of these definitions, and they also reviewed this module and kind of gave it their stamp of approval before we moved forward with showing it to students or anyone, which I'm super grateful for. At this point, we open up with the asset-based approach, and helping students to understand that when you look at a community and just talk about its problems or its gaps, it's often easy to ascribe those problems or gaps, so to speak, to the people who live there, when the reality is that that is not the cause of those problems. And we really expand on that a lot in this module. And so I kind of give them some tools for how to use an asset-based approach as they engage, and then talk about how kind of on that thread, that cultural humility is also recognizing that social issues are not caused by individuals and communities, but are rather systemic in nature and are rooted in centuries of inequitable and often unjust policies and frameworks that are built right into those communities from the start. So at this point, this 6-minute video plays. It's really amazing. If you haven't seen it before, I don't think that I could have ever explained or like attempted to kind of overview redlining and property tax, how it affects education, and all of these pieces in 6 minutes, but this video does a really great job as like a primer for that. So I really recommend it as a quick resource. Obviously, it doesn't explain them in their entirety by any means, but it does provide a great resource to open up that conversation. And it was very important to us that we opened up that conversation, because Louisville was the original redline city. Like, it was the prototype for redlining, and is still one of the most segregated cities in the country. So it's very clear, and once I show you all these data pieces, it'll be even more clear that our issues are tremendously rooted in systemic oppression and in segregation effectively. And so what I do at this point is open up these data points. And the reason I decided to kind of take this approach is that if we had just kind of explained these issues, I was concerned that some students from certain backgrounds might look at it and say, well, this is just like a liberal agenda. This is an alternative history. This is, you name it. They're just trying to tell us what to think. But the fact is, when you look at numbers, they're numbers. And they can make their own meaning of those data trends, as opposed to us telling them exactly what those numbers mean. So first, we look at some financial pieces. From the west end to the east end of Louisville, the income is so significantly divided. And then we look at that on a map with Bellarmine right in the middle, so they can see exactly where they sit between that gradient of those like living in poverty in Louisville and those living above the poverty line. We talk about education, so the degree attainment from the west end to the east end, and how, as you can see on that map as well, it's very divided. Health and wellness, and this is where honestly it's sad. Like, it's very sad reviewing these data pieces, but I need them to understand these data pieces, even if they are hard, because they need to really see those systemic pieces. And so food insecurity is kind of a big conversation at Bellarmine. We've recently opened a food pantry. So I knew this would be an issue that they would connect with. And so I talked about the access to grocery stores, and I talked about what food insecurity is. And then we looked at some environmental justice pieces, which we have an environmental studies department at Bellarmine, so also one that's very relevant to our students, but ultimately is just relevant as a piece of data because of the way that it affects our community. So most of the production in Louisville is in the west and south ends of Louisville, and as you can see, that carbon emission data is it is ridiculous. It's just frankly ridiculous, the difference. But a big piece of that is the tree canopy. So we have one of the worst also urban heat island effects in America. And what does that do to people's health? Well, that's what the next slide shows. But the tree canopy is about twice as much on the east end as it is on the west end. And what we kind of are able to talk about from that is that these environmental factors affect not only the quality of life, but also the life expectancy. So right now with COVID-19 really obviously affecting people with asthma and other health conditions, we see those being really high in the West End, and a lot of that is because of the emissions and the tree canopy. Also, cancer is extremely prevalent in the West End and is one of the leading causes of death, even higher than like other major causes of death in America. And so ultimately what it boils down to, unfortunately, is that the life expectancy in our very own city, our very own community, is over 10 years difference if you go east of Bellarmine or if you go west of Bellarmine. And so this is kind of where the data points wrap up and kind of shows them what the effects of all these systemic issues are. So the point kind of that we get to here is coming to an acknowledgement that it is very essential to recognize that systems have contributed to these inequitable outcomes, and that it's unreasonable, it's culturally arrogant to assume that people who live in poverty have caused their own poverty through like individual decisions or poor money management or some of the assumptions people make. And that is super harmful to enter a community that has great need with the belief that that community does not also have great assets and an expert awareness of those issues that they're facing. So it kind of brings to the point that practicing cultural humility while engaging with community involves, asset-based recognition, recognizing that the people in the communities are not the problem, but are the solution, and that the systems are the real problem. And so it also addresses how like effective community engagement not only remedies the effects of the systems, but also addresses the inequitable systems themselves. And the last slide here just offers them some sort of talking points and ways to practice, like actively practice cultural humility while they are engaging. So I'm gonna bring us back to our other presentation and screen share that to kind of talk about next steps. So everything I just showed you is in year one of its functionality. And so it's honestly a pilot, so to speak. And so there's a lot of room for growth. There's a lot of things that we could do better, do differently in these modules. We want to include community partner voices, for example. That was a huge oversight. We didn't, partially we didn't have time at the moment when we were, because our office started in July and obviously classes start in August. But we did not prioritize getting community partner voices in there, which is practicing sort of what we're preaching in the modules. Also, we would like to include a standard of ethics. So if you're not familiar with the HEMES principles, they're a really cool resource by the Southwest Network for Environmental and Economic Justice. And we'll probably adopt some of those principles to kind of include in this to ethically engage with the community. Also talk about like taking photos. So it's great to take photos of your peers and you volunteering to help kind of advertise those experiences and just document them. They're cool experiences in some cases, but it's not acceptable to take photos, right, of like clients or people who are utilizing services. And then also talking through kind of a Bellarmine value statement. So where do we sit as an institution on these issues? We also wanted to, from the start, actually include an accompanying appendix of resources. So, readings, videos, podcasts, whatever it might be. We just did not get to that either, frankly, at this time. And ultimately, I'm not a video producer. So I think that the modules are of a decent quality, but we would love to get just a better quality in these. Are there any other gaps that you all see before we talk about like how to implement and create these modules at your institutions? Are there gaps that you all see that you would like to provide feedback on?
I'm just kind of curious, do you do any like discussion about stereotypes that people might have about the community? Because that might be important information to share, especially if it's someone who maybe hasn't had experience with interacting with like someone who's from a first generation community. So maybe having like a discussion about stereotypes and biases that might be present to enhance their understanding.
Yeah, there's a little bit of that in that video, but I definitely hear that and agree that it could have a larger presence for sure. That is probably overlooked. Are there any other pieces that you all want to talk about?
I'm curious.
Thanks, Mary. One thing that we try to incorporate into our orientation materials are also like a bit more history on the community, so students have some context around sort of like where our community came from and how that sort of fits into some of the things they might see play out. So kind of similar to what you touched on with the data points and thinking about like segregation and redlining. But we also try to touch on some assets that are in our community too. So that I think contributes to the idea of like an asset-based approach to engagement. So we're talking about what some of the challenges are, or we sometimes will try to use like the wording of like, what are the priorities of our community to, avoid that sort of need-based approach, but also talking about what are some of the strengths and assets that already exist within our community that students might be able to connect to.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think that I'm hoping that too, like the community partner kind of voice does speak to that as well. But I definitely think that could be like a hugely heightened piece, especially because there's a lot of work, at least in our community, happening right now to kind of provide like documentation of the culture that exists in areas of the city that have been historically neglected, and how like strong a lot of like how much art and history and strength has come from a lot of those communities, regardless of the fact that our city has like deliberately neglected them.
Going along with what Allison mentioned, I was going to say a little bit of context to the institutional relationship that the school has with the community, and what being affiliated with your school, what connotations that brings up in the community that you're serving, right? Because sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative, right? Sometimes there's been institutional harm that's been committed in the past. And so students, just because you are affiliated with your school, sometimes, right, that carries with it a weight that means that a partner either is going to be receptive or dismissive to your outreach to begin with.
Thank you. I really appreciate your all's input, and like I wish we could talk about it for a lot longer, because I'm sure that you all could provide so much input that we could add. But also feel free to ever reach out to me if you're like burning to add something, and I genuinely would love to hear it. So thank you all so much. So kind of just to move to the next piece, like implementing on your campus. So I'm sure a lot of you already have orientations. This is not assuming that you don't, or that ours is in any way better. But if you were looking to implement something, especially using the data from your community, these are some pieces that you can kind of lean on. So the maps that you saw in that third module that are shaded in different ways, those are created with Social Explorer. So Social Explorer, unfortunately, is a really expensive program, but I didn't pay a penny for it personally. I reached out and asked for what they would do for us as an institution as a trial, and they gave us like 3 months, which was enough time to at least kind of sort through data on, for at least the first iteration of these modules. And in the future, if we wanted to revisit it, of course, we could opt to do that. But with being a brand new center, we didn't have a lot of resources. So that was a good opportunity to tap into the breadth of data they have. And it is insane how much data they have. Like they have every census record ever in America in there. Every, demographic piece, income piece, education, healthcare. Some of the pieces that were really interesting that I noted as well that are recent additions, I think, are obviously COVID-19 data is super recent, but they've also started to input records and documentation of enslavement, which I found was very helpful in understanding Louisville as well, because I've grown up in Louisville my whole life and I have never learned about enslavement in Louisville, and there was a lot of it. So there's records of of enslavement in terms of how many enslaved people were in those different cities and counties. Even there's records of, you know, marital status, like family status, all kinds, like more than I ever would have imagined existed in Social Explorer. A couple free, or a few free resources as well are census.data.gov, which is run by the government. And then censusdata.org and statisticalatlas.com also source census data, but are like external and are free. You may also find that your city has its own kind of reports and research. So Louisville recently published the Louisville Health Equity Report, which gave us a lot of that data on some of the healthcare pieces like asthma and whatnot. And then we also received data from some of our community partners. So you might find that your community partners probably have a ton of research because they, you know, do grant writing and all of this. They need that research. So for example, the tree canopy data is something I never could have found with like census data, of course, or anything like that. But it's a huge piece of our story in Louisville of why our life expectancy is so divided, and therefore is important to be able to include. And then of course, so to create the content, like know your audience. What are the blind spots in your student body? For our student body, it might be that they have never been to parts of the city where there are more nonprofit organizations, or it might be that they have not been familiar with some of the social programs that exist, or whatever it might be. Have you observed your students in scenarios where they are volunteering? Have you surveyed them? Have you also asked or surveyed community partners what their experience has been like when they've worked with students from your institution? And then thinking through like what other resources can you tap into for content? And then integrating the models, like getting them off the ground and utilized with students. Leveraging your influence. So what initiatives do you already oversee or contribute to? Like, do you oversee alternative spring break so you can already just get the alternative spring break students to utilize these? Do you oversee, or do you work with people who, you know, organize service learning or whatever it might be? And then capitalizing on your network. So honestly, I would say at our institution, there's a little bit of a divide between faculty and staff, which is probably not unique to our institution. But in order to kind of start plugging this in with some faculty members who do service learning, I really just reached out to the ones that I'm already close to. And I asked like, hey, would you be open to implementing this and giving feedback and having your students survey at the end of it so that I can understand what gaps there are for the students. And then obviously advertising it as a resource. So you're taking a lot of the work off somebody's plate by providing this kind of resource. So at this time, I would love to just open up if people have questions, or Nick, if people put questions in the chat that they would like to be addressed. I actually was able to pull up the chat now that it just let me know. Sorry, I'm glancing through it. Did anyone have any questions that they wanted to just unmute and ask?
Sure, I have a quick question. Is there a model of service learning project model at universities where it is a requirement for students to participate, like in general, to have that kind of experience?
Let me see if I understand your question. So like at the institution where I work, are you asking, is there a requirement to do service learning before they graduate?
Yeah, I guess in general, I'm thinking about the cultural competency piece and being culturally humble and all that stuff. Like, you can read about it, and a lot of people read books and book clubs. And I'm just thinking the best way to learn about this stuff is to do it, is to go out and do it. And it would be, I'm just dreaming of a way to make my students have to do something that's more than just, I don't know, a canned food drive or something like that, you know, something more. And I don't know if there's something that exists at your institution or that you've heard of at others. Like, I'm thinking about, oh gosh, what is that school out Northeast, in Eastern Kentucky. But yeah.
Yeah, so I really love Bria. I'm like obsessed with Bria. But we're not as robust in that way. But we do have so one huge change that we're undergoing right now is we have not updated our core curriculum requirements in over 20 years. And we're currently in the process of updating our core. And one of the pieces that will be included in the new core, we're not 100% sure what it'll look like yet, but is that there will be a community engagement requirement that's interwoven between all 4 years. So in the first year, they do like most, many institutions have like an orientation, service event. The second year is going to be called sophomore serve, and so they're going to have to do something that's more integrated. And then junior and senior year, they can do like a lot of different things, but we super promote doing nonprofit internships. And we find we have grant funding to pay students to do those so that they can, instead of interning with organizations that have funds to pay them, they can intern with nonprofits who normally cannot pay them, that they can one, learn a lot from, but also provide some services to potentially for like sustained projects that those organizations have defined as needs. We do we now have a +1 practicum, which is also a great option for juniors especially. So that's a 30-hour commitment that they earn 1 course credit for. They can work with any organization that they would like to, even internationally, because they can work remotely if they want to. We have a number of students who are doing virtual internships and practicums right now, and even working with our students who are in non-traditional instruction online, and helping to work with them through that process. So, we launched in a pandemic, which was interesting. But we're actually seeing a lot of opportunities there that we didn't know existed. And then to Emily's question about measurable changes, that's a super important question, and something I didn't really include, but we have like feedback from them and reflection pieces. Oh, I think it's about to kick me out. So we can follow up.
You have another minute. You'll have another minute before you go.
Oh, okay, cool. And also, if you want to connect with us too, we're super active on our Instagram, which is Bellarmine CCE. So obviously we have like email address and website and all of that as well. But I would love, to connect too on Instagram, because then we can kind of learn from each other's content too. And to sort of reflect on, or to respond to that question about reflection, it's been interesting because we've seen kind of like what we talked about, students who are really unfamiliar with these issues responded like, wow, like I never would have considered that, I didn't know that, etc. And students who have the lived experience of dealing with those issues, more so than the others, have responded, I'm obviously aggregating this right now, but responded like, yeah, I've lived this, I know that this exists, but I'm grateful that it is defining it in some sort of like terms or statistics or pieces that make sense of those experiences. So
Welcome back, everyone. We've had a full afternoon with many opportunities to engage and recharge. Before we depart, I want to leave you, I'd like to get in a few reflections that have been logged throughout the afternoon. Gail Hillicky, Executive Director of Kentucky Campus Compact, will share some reflections from our social media page.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hamilton. What I can say is that people have really loved the day today. It started out with Dr. Bankston's amazing inspirational talk, and several of the things that she said really stuck with folks. Some of her quotes: "Those who name me can shame me," "the new slavery, criminal justice," and choices that we can reconsider. So she gave us some actual steps, and people were really interested in what steps they could take. Some people said, you know, thinking about who their circle of friends was, or thinking about where they buy things, and you know, make a point of buying from a minority business. Thinking about the misconceptions we've had over our lives that we've grown up with. And then with the panel discussion, people were really inspired with, they thought about the great things that are happening in the greater Cincinnati region. There was just some great examples, and they felt that there was a lot of hope in that panel discussion. There was great comments about the dance presentation by Teresa and her students about the amazing innovation and creativeness, and how people felt like they really had an opportunity to create together. And so there was a lot of great comments about that. And then we went to our breakout sessions, which I had benefited a lot from. We didn't get a lot of interaction on Facebook because we were interacting together. So all in all, Dr. Hamilton, I think people really had a great experience today.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Gail. As we end our conference, I want to leave you with a few questions to think about. Question number 1 is, what are some takeaways that you will put into place immediately following this conference? Question number 2, how has this virtual conference empowered you to engage in anti-racist community behaviors and activities? Question 3, how will you continue the conversation in ways that leads to actionable and transformational outcomes? I want to thank again our sponsors, the DeVue Good Foundation and the Carol Ann and Ralph V. Hale Jr. Foundation, and the Greater Cincinnati Service Learning Network institutions. They are the Kentucky Campus Compact, the Ohio Campus Compact, Miami University Regionals, Mount St. Joseph University, Northern Kentucky University, the University of Cincinnati, and Xavier University. Finally, I want to thank each of you, the participants, for showing up and being engaged. Please keep an eye out for a follow-up survey. Complete it for a chance to win an Unlearn Racism mask that was manufactured by a local Black-owned business, and it will be shipped to you. Let's continue the conversation by joining us in the Anti-Racist Community Engagement Virtual Conference Facebook group. Thank you all again.